The winter of 1883 came down on the Dakota Territories like a hammer. It was not a gentle, snow globe kind of winter that decorated the pines and invited children to play. It was a weapon. The cold was a physical presence, an invading army that laid siege to the small, hopeful settlement of Providence Flats. It did not knock before it entered. It seeped through the thickest logs, found the smallest cracks in the chinking, and settled deep into the bones of the people who had dared to build their lives on that unforgiving prairie. The wind was its scout, a relentless whisper that turned into a shriek, carrying ice crystals that scoured the land like a billion tiny knives. The settlers of Providence Flats were not weak people. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and loggers, men and women hardened by the journey west and the labor of carving a town from nothing. They knew how to build.
They had raised a dozen sturdy cabins, all to the same proven design. Thick, hand-hewn logs, dovetailed at the corners, with stone fireplaces that were the hungry, beating hearts of each home. They had faced winters before, but this one was different. This winter had a cruel intelligence. It seemed to study their defenses and mock them. The central conflict was a simple, brutal equation of heat. A man could spend all day felling trees and splitting logs, his breath freezing in clouds before his face, only to feed a fire that gave back a paltry circle of warmth 3 feet wide. Beyond that circle, the cold ruled. Frost grew on the interior walls in delicate, deadly ferns of ice. A cup of water left on a table overnight would be a solid block by morning. Families slept in huddled masses, buried under every quilt and animal hide they owned. Yet they still shivered, the cold a constant, draining pressure.
Their cabins, the very symbols of their conquest over the wilderness, were failing them. They were becoming tombs of ice, slowly freezing their inhabitants. This struggle was universal. In the cabin of Silas Blackwood, the settlement's most respected builder, his wife wrapped their infant daughter in layers of wool until the child was a motionless bundle. Yet her tiny hands and feet remained as cold as stone. Silas fed his massive fireplace with a grim fury, stuffing it with seasoned oak that should have roasted the room, but the heat seemed to vanish into the air, stolen by a thief he could not see. Down the path, the Miller family had taken to heating rocks in their fire and carrying them to bed, a desperate, temporary measure that only highlighted their losing battle. They were all doing the same thing, following the same traditions their fathers had taught them, and they were all suffering the same slow defeat. The wilderness was not conquered. It was merely tolerating them, and its tolerance was wearing thin. Into this landscape of shared hardship came Elara. She was a widow, having lost her husband to a logging accident the previous spring. She had arrived with him from a land of high, cold mountains and deep, shadowed valleys across the ocean, a place where winter was not a season, but a way of life. She was quiet, with a stillness about her that the other women mistook for timidity. They saw a frail woman with 2 small children, a son named Finn and a daughter named Anya, and they pitied her. They saw her as another mouth to feed, another soul likely to be broken by the coming frost. They did not see the knowledge that lay behind her calm, observant eyes, a knowledge passed down through generations of people who had learned to live with the cold, not just fight it. Elara watched the men of Providence Flats build their cabins. She saw the pride they took in the straightness of their walls and the height of their roofs. They built tall, square, and fast, racing against the first snowfall. They built as if to impose their will upon the prairie, to stand defiantly against the vast, open sky. Elara saw not strength, but vulnerability. She saw walls that caught the full force of the wind. She saw roofs that shed snow, but also shed heat at an astonishing rate. She saw foundations laid just deep enough to be stable, but not deep enough to borrow the earth's steady temperance.
She saw men fighting a war of attrition against the cold, a war they were destined to lose because they fought with the wrong strategy. Her own plot of land sat at the edge of the settlement, on a gentle, south-facing slope. While others were felling the tallest trees for their walls, Ilara spent her days walking the slope, studying the way the sun moved across it, feeling the direction of the prevailing winds. She carried a shovel, not an axe. The other settlers watched her, puzzled. Her children, Finn and Anya, trailed behind her, their small hands helping to clear stones and pull up stubborn prairie grass. The community's pity for her began to curdle into a strange sort of suspicion. She was not acting like a proper widow, helpless and awaiting aid. She was planning something, and it was something no one understood. One afternoon, Silas Blackwood, his face etched with a mixture of genuine concern and professional pride, approached her. He saw the strange shape she had marked out on the ground with lines of scavenged twine and small stones. It was not a square. It was a long, deep rectangle, oriented to the south, and it seemed to sink into the hill itself. "Mr. Ilara," he began, his voice slow and deliberate, as if speaking to a child. "The first snow will be here in a month. You have no logs cut, no foundation laid. A woman alone. It is no shame to ask for help. The community will raise a cabin for you and your children." Ilara looked up from her work, her hands smudged with dirt. She met his gaze directly. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice clear and steady, with the lilting accent of her homeland. "But my home will be built differently. It will not stand against the wind. It will hide from it." She pointed to the rectangular outline. "Here," she said, "will be my walls, and they will be made of earth." This was the moment her idea was revealed, not as a grand pronouncement, but as a simple statement of fact. She was going to dig her house, not build it. Silas stared at the lines in the dirt, his mind struggling to comprehend her words. "Made of earth?" he repeated, a frown deepening the lines on his forehead. "You mean a sod house? Those are for desperate men on the flatlands, temporary things that leak and crumble. This is a forest. We have timber, good, strong oak." He gestured to the proud cabins of the settlement, their chimneys already beginning to send up plumes of smoke in the crisp autumn air. "That is how a proper home is built. Strong, tall." "A tall house is a cold house," Ilara replied simply. "The wind is a wolf. It circles the tall house and bites at it from all sides. My house will be a badger's den. The wolf can howl all it wants, but the badger is warm in its burrow." The concept was utterly alien to him. Houses were built up, toward the sky, a testament to man's dominion. What she was proposing was to retreat, to burrow like an animal. It struck him as backward, almost cowardly. Word of her plan spread through Providence Flats like a grass fire. The men, gathered at the small trading post, laughed into their cups of cider. "Blackwood says the widow is digging her own grave," one man chuckled. Another, a lanky logger named Jeb, shook his head. "She's lost her mind with grief. Thinks she's a prairie dog. Her children will freeze before the new year." The women were more charitable, but their whispers were just as dismissive. "Poor thing," one would say to another over a fence. "She comes from some strange country. They must not know how to build properly there." The community's skepticism was not silent. It was a chorus of doubt that followed Ilara as she worked. Men would stop by her plot on their way to the forest, leaning on their axes and offering unsolicited, condescending advice. "You'll never get deep enough before the ground freezes," Silas warned her, his tone that of a disappointed teacher. "And when the spring thaw comes, you'll be living in a mud pit. You're creating a cellar, woman, not a home." Jeb was blunter. "That thing will be a tomb for you and them kids. You get a heavy snow, the roof will cave in, and nobody will even know you're down there." They saw her digging not as an act of construction, but as an act of foolish, stubborn self-destruction. Their mockery was a wall she had to endure every single day, as real and as cold as the one she was trying to build. Elara did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply worked. Her answer to their words was the rhythmic scrape of her shovel against the soil, the thud of dirt piling up beside the deepening pit. Her children were her only helpers.
Finn, small but determined, used a bucket to haul out loose dirt, while Anya gathered smooth, flat stones from the nearby creek bed. They worked from sunup to sundown, a small, isolated family unit, moving with a quiet, shared purpose. Their diligence was a silent rebuke to the laughter that echoed from the town. The physical labor was immense, a grueling test of endurance. The topsoil gave way to a dense layer of clay, and then to rocky earth that fought back against her shovel. Her hands, soft from a life before the frontier, became calloused and raw. Her back ached with a fire that never quite went out. But with every inch she dug, she felt not despair, but a growing sense of security. She was not just digging a hole, she was building a shield. She was carving a space that would be protected by the greatest insulator she knew, the planet itself. The earth, with its deep, abiding warmth, would be her ally. While Elara toiled in her pit, the sounds of Providence Flats were of a different kind of labor. The ringing of axes, the shouts of men raising log walls for a late-coming family, the confident hammering of pegs and planks. They were finishing their winter preparations in the traditional way. They stacked firewood into massive cords that stood like wooden soldiers beside their homes. They patched their chinking with fresh mud and moss. They were busy, productive, and certain in their methods. Silas Blackwood put the finishing touches on a new smokehouse, his work swift and precise, a model of frontier craftsmanship. Every time he glanced over at Elara's ever-deepening hole in the ground, he shook his head with a sigh that was part pity, part frustration. She was wasting precious time on a mad fantasy. By the time the first hard frost came, turning the prairie grass to brittle glass, Elara's pit was nearly 6 feet deep, 20 feet long, and 10 feet wide. She had lined the bottom and the lower walls with the flat stones Anya had collected, creating a solid, dry floor and a foundation that would not easily erode. Now, the most crucial part of the construction began. She did not use full-sized logs for the main structure. Instead, she used shorter, stout timbers to frame an interior space, leaving a gap of nearly 2 feet between the timber frame and the earthen walls of the pit. This was a detail no one but her understood. It was a space for insulation. She began to fill this gap with a mixture she made herself. Dry straw from the prairie, mixed with the heavy clay she had excavated. She packed it down layer by layer, creating a thick, dense barrier. This was the core of her idea. The earth outside would insulate from the deep cold, and this packed straw and clay mixture would provide a second layer of defense, preventing the interior warmth from leaching out into the surrounding soil. It was slow, painstaking work. Mixing the heavy clay with the straw was exhausting, and packing it tightly into the narrow space required contorting her body in the cramped darkness. The roof was another departure from tradition. Instead of a steep A-frame designed to shed snow, she built a low, gently sloped roof using heavy beams that rested on the timber frame. She covered this with thick planks, then a layer of oiled canvas for waterproofing. But she didn't stop there. On top of the canvas, she and the children carefully placed a thick layer of the prairie sod they had first dug up, grass side up. The final layer was a thick blanket of loose earth. Her roof was alive. In the spring, it would grow grass and wildflowers. In the winter, it would hold a thick blanket of snow, which, as she knew from her homeland, was one of the best insulators of all.
The entrance was the strangest part, the detail that most baffled and amused the onlookers. There was no door in the wall. Instead, a long, narrow trench sloped down from the ground level into the side of the structure. She framed this trench with wood and built a low, tunnel-like roof over it. This created a sunken, angled entryway. At the end of the tunnel, there was a heavy, insulated door, but it was hidden from view, deep within the earth. To anyone standing outside, the cabin appeared to have no entrance at all, just a low, sod-covered mound rising from the hillside. As the final touch before the snows, she stacked dozens of straw bales around the exposed parts of the structure and over the entrance tunnel, adding yet another thick layer of insulation. It looked less like a home and more like a farmer's forgotten haystack. The laughter in the settlement grew louder. "The widow's buried her house before the winter could," Jeb bellowed to his friends. Then, the winter that had been threatening on the horizon finally attacked. It began not with a gentle flurry, but with a leaden, gray sky that seemed to drop until it was touching the tops of the trees. The air grew unnaturally still and heavy, and a deep, penetrating cold set in, a cold that felt different from the crisp frosts of autumn. It was a dry, brittle cold that stole the breath and made the trees groan in protest. The old-timers looked at the sky, at the strange, pale sun, and they felt a prickle of fear. They had seen skies like this before, and they knew what followed. They called it the White Death, the Great White Hurricane, the landlocked blizzard that came not from the sea, but from the heart of the Arctic itself. The storm arrived in the dead of night. It came as a low moan on the wind, a sound that grew steadily into a deafening, inhuman roar. The wind did not just blow. It struck the cabins of Providence Flats like a physical blow, a battering ram of frozen air. Snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, a blinding, stinging torrent of ice particles that erased the world, reducing visibility to 0. The temperature plummeted, 10 below, 20 below, then 30, and it kept dropping. The very air seemed to be freezing solid. Inside the traditional cabins, the siege began in earnest. The wind, like a ravenous predator, found every tiny gap, every hairline crack. It screamed through the gaps in the window frames and whistled under the doors. It forced its way through the chinking between the logs, carrying with it a fine, powder-like snow that began to accumulate in small drifts on the floors. The fires, which had been the centers of life, now became monuments to futility. Men fed them constantly, log after log, but the raging drafts sucked the heat straight up the chimneys. The rooms grew colder and colder. The battle for warmth was being lost. In Silas Blackwood's cabin, a place he had built with his own 2 hands and considered the finest in the settlement, the failure was absolute. The walls, which had felt so solid and reassuring, now radiated a deadly cold. His wife huddled with their baby, her face pale with fear, as Silas desperately stuffed rags into the cracks around the door, a futile gesture against an invisible, invincible enemy. He could hear the timbers of his own roof groaning under the weight of the wind. He had burned through a day's worth of wood in just a few hours, and the cold was winning. He looked at the thermometer he had proudly hung by the hearth. It read 5 degrees above 0, inside his house. He was a master builder, and his family was freezing to death in a home he had built to protect them. The rest of the community shared his fate. The Miller family ran out of firewood just after dawn on the second day of the storm. They broke up a chair for fuel, then a small table, their desperation growing with each passing hour. In another cabin, a water barrel froze solid and split, flooding the floor with a sheet of ice. Families abandoned all pretense of normal life and simply huddled together in their beds, sharing body heat, listening to the storm try to tear their homes apart. The proud, tall cabins that were meant to be symbols of their defiance against nature had become their prisons, flimsy wooden boxes that offered little protection from the Arctic fury. Hope began to dwindle, replaced by a cold, primal fear. Meanwhile, in the low, sod-covered mound on the edge of town, the world was different. The storm was not a roar, it was a distant, muffled hum. The wind that was tearing at the other cabins passed harmlessly over the low, aerodynamic roof of Ilara's home.
The thick blanket of snow that was crushing the spirits of the other settlers was, for her, a final, perfect layer of insulation, a gift from the storm itself. Down the sunken, straw bale-lined tunnel, behind the heavy, sealed door, there was no draft. Not a single whisper of the gale outside penetrated her sanctuary. Inside, a small iron stove glowed with a gentle, steady warmth. It required only a single, small log every hour or so. The heat it produced did not vanish up a chimney. It radiated outwards, warming the air, the wooden inner walls, and the dense stone floor. The packed clay and straw insulation held the warmth like a thermos, and the great mass of the surrounding earth acted as a massive thermal battery, absorbing the heat and slowly, evenly releasing it back into the room. The air was still and calm. The temperature was a steady 65 degrees. Anya was on the floor, playing with a set of wooden animals her father had carved. Finn was at the small table, reading a book by the light of a single oil lamp. Ilara sat nearby, mending a tear in his trousers. They were not just surviving the storm. They were living through it, untouched, in a pocket of quiet, stable warmth. Her creation was being tested by the worst the prairie could throw at it, and it was succeeding completely. The storm raged for 3 days and 3 nights without pause. When its fury finally abated, it left behind a world transformed, a landscape of profound and dangerous beauty. Everything was buried under a deep, sculpted blanket of white. The cabins of Providence Flats were encased in snow, with drifts piled up to their eaves. The temperature remained brutally low, a lingering threat even after the wind had died. The struggle for survival had merely entered a new phase. Woodpiles were depleted, food was running low, and a sickness, born of the deep, unrelenting cold, was beginning to spread. Silas Blackwood's daughter was coughing, a dry, rasping sound that tore at his heart. The cold in his cabin had settled in her small chest. He knew he needed to get her to a warmer place, but there was no warmer place. Every home in the settlement was just as cold, just as dangerous as his own. His pride as a builder had been shattered, replaced by the raw fear of a father. His mind, frantic and desperate, circled back again and again to the one place that was different. The widow's foolish burrow, the tomb. He had mocked it, dismissed it, but what if he was wrong? The thought was a small, fragile spark in the cold darkness of his despair. He had to know. He bundled himself in every layer of clothing he owned and stepped out into the blinding, frozen world. The cold was shocking, a pain that seared his lungs with every breath. He fought his way through waist-deep snow, his legs heavy, his progress agonizingly slow. The settlement was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of his own boots on the snow. When he reached Ilara's plot of land, he almost couldn't find it. All he saw was a smooth, white mound, adrift like any other. There was no smoke, no sign of life. A terrible thought struck him. Jeb had been right. The roof had caved in. They were buried. He stumbled closer, shouting her name, his voice swallowed by the vast, snowy silence. "Ilara, are you in there?" He reached the mound and began to dig frantically with his hands at the spot where he thought the entrance should be. His fingers quickly grew numb. Panic set in. He was about to turn back, defeated, when a section of the snow seemed to shift from below. A small wooden panel was pushed upwards, and Elara emerged from the ground like a creature from a fairy tale. She was wearing a simple wool dress and was not even shivering. A wave of calm, impossibly warm air washed over him from the opening. He stared at her, speechless. He had come expecting to find a disaster, a frozen tragedy. Instead, he found a woman who looked as if she had just been sitting by a pleasant fire on a mild autumn day. He looked down into the sunken entryway she had cleared from the inside. He saw the heavy inner door, now standing open. He felt the warmth pouring out of it, a steady, gentle heat that felt more miraculous than the rising of the sun. It was not the scorching, temporary heat of a roaring fire, but a deep, pervasive warmth that seemed to emanate from the very walls. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice even, "you look frozen. Come inside." He hesitated for a moment, his pride warring with his desperation. Then he looked back towards his own cabin, where his daughter was shivering with fever, and his pride crumbled into dust. He stumbled down the few steps of the trench and through the inner door. The transition was instantaneous and profound. The screaming cold vanished, replaced by a peaceful, comfortable warmth. The air was still. His frozen cheeks began to ache as the feeling returned to them. He saw the children, healthy and calm, playing on the floor. He saw the small, efficient stove burning with a quiet flame. He was standing in the middle of the warmest, safest, most comfortable room he had ever been in his life, and it was a hole in the ground. He was wrong. Utterly, completely, and dangerously wrong. Elara said nothing of his previous mockery. She did not say, "I told you so." She simply ladled a cup of hot broth from a pot on the stove and handed it to him. "Your family?" she asked. "My daughter," he croaked, his throat tight. "She is sick with the cold." He looked around the room again, at the smooth, wooden inner walls, the dry stone floor, the sturdy ceiling beams. He touched one of the walls. It was not cold, it was faintly warm to the touch. It was all so simple, so logical, yet it had been completely beyond his imagination. He had been so sure of his own knowledge, so trapped by tradition, that he had nearly led his family to its doom. "Bring them here," Elara said. It was not a question or a suggestion, but a simple, compassionate instruction. "There is room." Silas looked at this quiet woman, this outsider he had pitied and scorned. In her eyes, he saw not triumph, but a deep, steady strength and a profound wisdom. He nodded, unable to speak, and turned to leave. As he stepped back out into the brutal cold, the contrast was a physical shock. The air outside his own cabin had felt normal. Now, it felt like what it was, a lethal, alien environment. The warmth of Elara's home lingered on his skin, a promise and a judgment. News of Silas's experience spread through the settlement with the speed of desperation. He first brought his own wife and sick child, carrying the bundled infant through the snow. The moment they entered Elara's home, the change in the child was visible. Her shivering subsided, and the pinched, blue look around her lips began to fade in the gentle, steady warmth. Silas's wife wept with relief. He then went to the Miller family, who were huddled together in the dark, their last piece of furniture smoldering in their fireplace. He told them, his voice raw with emotion, "You will not believe it. It's warm. Go, now." One by one, then in small groups, the people of Providence Flats made the pilgrimage through the snow to the strange mound on the hill. Each of them had the same reaction. They would arrive, shivering and skeptical, and see the unassuming hole in the snow. They would step through the hidden door and be struck silent by the impossible warmth. They saw Elara, moving calmly through her home, offering broth and blankets to the children who were now filling the space.
The laughter and mockery that had once been directed at her were gone, replaced by a profound and humbling silence.
They were standing inside her foolishness, and it was the only thing saving them. The very people who had called it a tomb were now seeking refuge in it as a sanctuary. The great skeptic Jeb was among the last to arrive. His face was grim, his pride a stubborn fortress. But his own son had a fever, and his wife's pleading had finally broken through his obstinacy. He ducked through the low door, expecting a damp, cramped cellar. He found himself in a bright, warm room filled with his neighbors. He saw Silas Blackwood sitting on the floor, holding his sleeping daughter, his face a mask of gratitude. Jeb looked at Alara, and for the first time he saw her not as a madwoman, but as a visionary. His shoulders slumped, the arrogance draining out of him, leaving only the shame of his own ignorance. A few days later, when the worst of the cold snap had passed, and people had returned to their own damaged, frigid homes, Silas Blackwood came back to Alara's door. He did not come for refuge this time. He came with a slate tablet and a piece of charcoal in his hand. He stood before her, his hat in his hands, his head bowed. "Mistress Alara," he said, his voice thick with humility, "I was a fool, a proud, blind fool. What I know, it is nothing. What you know, it is everything." He held up the slate. "Teach me," he said. "Please, teach me how you did this." Alara did not hesitate. She invited him in and, for the first time, explained the principles behind her design. She did not use complex terms. She spoke of the earth as a blanket. She explained how the sun on a south-facing slope warms the ground all day, and how that warmth can be captured and stored. She drew a simple diagram on his slate, showing the sunken entrance that acted as a trap for cold air, preventing it from ever reaching the living space. She crumbled a piece of dried clay and mixed it with straw in her palm, showing him how the two materials worked together to hold air and stop the flow of heat. She shared her knowledge as freely as she had shared her warmth. She held nothing back. She answered every one of Silas's questions with patience and clarity. He, the master builder, became the humble student. He filled his slate with notes and diagrams, his mind racing to absorb these new, revolutionary ideas. It was a complete reversal of the established order. The quiet, foreign widow was now the most important source of wisdom in the entire settlement, and the respected community leader was her first and most eager pupil. That spring, a new sound echoed across Providence Flats. It was not the ring of the axe, but the scrape of the shovel. The entire community, under the guidance of Silas and the quiet supervision of Alara, began to rebuild. They did not try to fix their old, flawed cabins. They abandoned them. They chose new spots on the south-facing slopes and began to dig. The landscape of the settlement started to change. Instead of tall, square cabins dotting the prairie, low, earthen mounds began to rise from the hillsides. The men who had once laughed at Alara now sought her approval on the angle of their roofs and the depth of their foundations. The women came to her, asking about the best way to seal the inner walls and how to plant the right grasses on the sod roofs. She never once reminded them of their past foolishness. She simply shared what she knew, helping them build homes that worked in harmony with the land, not in opposition to it. The settlement was reborn, its architecture transformed by the hard-won lesson of a single, brutal winter. The story of the woman who built into the ground and survived the Great Blizzard of '83 became a quiet legend in the territories. Travelers passing through Providence Flats would stare in wonder at the strange and beautiful village of living roofs and sunken doors. They would arrive expecting a hard-bitten frontier town and would find a community that was thriving, a people who had learned the secret to a comfortable life
in an unforgiving climate. They took the story and the building principles with them. Surveyors and land agents, hearing the tale, made detours to see the town for themselves. The idea spread, carried by word of mouth from one new settlement to another, a quiet movement of practical wisdom. Elara's badger den became the model for a new generation of prairie homes. Years later, Elara, now an old woman with grandchildren of her own, would sit outside her home on a warm summer evening. She would look out over a village of green, flower-covered mounds, smoke curling peacefully from their hidden chimneys. The tall, ghost-like shells of the original cabins still stood in the distance, slowly rotting back into the earth, a silent monument to the pride and ignorance that had almost destroyed them all. She had never sought credit or praise. Her reward was in the quiet breathing of her sleeping family, in the sight of a community that was safe and warm, a community that had learned the most important lesson the frontier could teach. The greatest strength is not found in standing tall against the storm, but in the wisdom to bend to it. The deepest knowledge is not in imposing your will upon the world, but in listening to what it has to teach you. It is a lesson about the quiet triumph of observation over assumption, of humility over pride. It is the story of how a single, quiet voice, armed with an old truth, can be more powerful than the loudest chorus of doubt, and how true shelter is found not in fighting the cold, but in embracing the warmth of the earth. If this story reminded you of the power of quiet wisdom, share it with someone who believes in listening to the lessons of the past. And follow for more inspiring stories of survival, courage, and ingenuity.